everybody. It's Trevor Jamieson here in my house and in my apartment, rather. It's not a house, it's pretty small. And so I'm here to bring you a couple lessons this week on theology of being. Now, this sounds like a big word, a big topic, but I'm going to break it down for you. I think it's really exciting and a great topic to explore, especially when we have an opportunity to be whoever we want as a church right now. We can be as cool or not awesome, I guess, as we want, right? Even in your life, to change whoever you want to be, right? We've recognized we got more time for family, we got more time to just sit around on the couch or to think about things like I have. So I want to talk about being. Now, this sounds like a very conceptual term, something a little crazy to think about, maybe a little ivory tower, right? Fancy philosophy sort of word. But actually, being isn't, we use this term all the time. So when we are born and then we're growing up, the first thing you get asked as a child is, what do you want to be when you grow up? Asked 100,000 times, and it's so fun to hear kids' answers. In fact, actually, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a veterinarian for a while. And I wanted to take care of dogs. It just seemed like so fun, and to work with people's pets. And pets are so nice. They're not like human beings, and sounded a lot more fun. So, but the problem was, okay, I'm actually severely allergic to dogs and cats and anything with four legs, basically. Never owned a dog or a cat growing up. I had a bird, in fact, and a couple hermit crabs. Not quite what you would say veterinarian material. So let's keep going with this, right? Because when you ask a kid, what do you want to be? You don't just ask them, what do you want to have as your job profession one day? Now, actually, you're asking them, like, what do you want to define yourself as? What do you want to have as the existence of the rest of your life? This is a huge question, actually, and I don't think kids are necessarily thinking about the ramifications of what it means to be a veterinarian for the rest of their life, as evidenced by me. But we see that being defines everything, right? It defines the existence of your life. It's who you want to define yourself as, and what we see in our culture actually is that we want to define ourselves in terms of being within the parameters of wealth and power, right? Because when we're kids, we often hear kids talk about, well, I want to be a fireman, or I want to be a garbage worker. But pretty quickly on, though it's cute for a while, our culture then shifts, right? We have a pivot when we enter into either, I don't know, maybe high school or something, when you really start taking your profession seriously. And all of a sudden, everyone wants to be, right, doctors and lawyers and bankers. And none of those are wrong professions, but we give lip service to our sanitation workers. But do we really value that as a profession? And why not? I think as a culture, we see being in terms of wealth and power. That's who we are as Americans. That's how we want to define ourselves as. And in fact, we pride ourselves. The size of our military, the strength of our nation, the wealth of our country, all these things, right, define who we are in our being. Now, most of these things are not necessarily bad, right? Okay. But the problem with that is that when you put your being, your country's being, whatever it is, right? Let's go with your being into your job. What happens when your job changes? So I think this is what happens when we have midlife crises, right? All of a sudden we go from having our being in this job for 50 years, when all of that, we start to have maybe a little perspective, right? On how just transient our life is. It's just at the whim of our job. It's at the whim of the stock market. It's at the whim of coronaviruses. Right? Our being is on shaky ground, as we say. So we're going to be looking at being and specifically what it means for the being of God. Because I think the easy Christian answer is, you probably already predicted it, that what we're supposed to root our being in is actually God in God's self, right? That God is the only stable being that we can root ourselves in. Because money and work and power, all these things will pass away. They're only earthly, they're only transient, they're passing. It's not even what the philosophers saw. That's not something that encapsulate being itself. They're just lower forms. Being is the highest. So let's take a look through a couple lessons. All right, this is the first one. We're going to be talking about today the being of God. Let's get to it. All right. First, we're going to be talking about God's being. Right. So you cannot begin to talk about God's being without talking about Jesus Christ, because Jesus is the way that we understand the Father. Jesus said, while he walked this earth, if you knew me, you would know the Father. Right. And if you knew the Father, you would know me. So to know Jesus is actually to know God's true being. And in fact, the book of Hebrews says that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. His being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. There are two ways that we understand Jesus. The first is as God became flesh, right? As this fleshly human being that walked this earth who was also fully God. He is also, right, the Word, the revelation of God to us. But he's that, he is also, right, God, the ineffable, unspeakable, incomprehensible God himself. He is God who cannot be captured by fleshly actions or by words. And the book of John even gets at this, right? That Jesus, it cannot be captured, right? John says that no amount of books, no amount of words could ever capture all the things that Jesus did in his physical body, much less, right? John is implying who Jesus is actually in his human person. This is why we don't have just a biography of Jesus in the New Testament. Because if it was just about documenting his life and all the things he exactly did and how we're supposed to exactly live, then Jesus would just be a book. But God is so much more. So as the revealed word, Jesus comes to us and becomes like us. And this is known as the theological term. Okay, get ready. Here's the theological term. It's going to be okay. Kenosis. Right? What kenosis means simply is the self-emptying of God. Right? We wanted a simple term as theologians to describe what happens here when God empties himself. This is captured in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. Who, being in the very nature of God, Jesus, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very form or nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Did you hear all the being words in there, by the way? You're starting to see it, I hope now. All the connections of what being actually is an important theological idea, because we're told that he is the exact being, the exact representation of God. So what does that mean? Well, it's manifest in the fact that he became a human being. He became like us. He gave up everything, gave up all his power, considered all of that nothing to be like a human. But it doesn't just stop there. He didn't just become a human. He became obedient to death. Wow, think about that for a second. If God became human, we would think the fullness of being, especially based off our cultural stuff, is to become a king, is to become a president, is to become the most powerful CEO, all of these things that we build our lives on, and Jesus dismisses all of that. Becomes basically a homeless rabbi who's despised by people. Wow. There's a lot there I don't have time to go into today. But think about that, right? Think about that. Became obedient to death. Not to kinglyship, not to life, to death. Became obedient to death. But let's go back to the kenosis idea. Because we're told that he became like a man. He dismissed all that power that he had. So this is an interesting idea that we know God not by ascending up to God. We know God by him descending. Just by the act of descending, we can know God. We know God's nature, right? So often that we think of being like God is to be the most powerful, to control everything, to despise human beings, to judge other people. But it's actually to lower self, to give up everything. Now, we might have heard this before. We might understand this to be true. But have you ever been in a room where you're the most intelligent person on a certain topic, right? Say you're a police officer and someone's talking about law enforcement. Maybe you're a baker like me and someone starts talking about baking cookies or bread. Maybe you're a car mechanic and someone starts talking about working on cars and pretending like they're the expert. And I want you to time yourself next time and see how long it takes you before you shut that person down because they said something wrong. Because it's easier for us to want to assert our power and authority and knowledge over another person than it is to give it up. And that's exactly what Jesus shows, is to be like God. Is to give it up. We know God in his descending. But we also know God in the fact that God descends into us. John 14:26 says, "The Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." This is interesting because, first of all, this is a commentary by Jesus upon the scriptures themselves. He knows that his disciples will write the scriptures to follow, right? To recount his life and to say the things that happen. But he doesn't just say it's going to be some natural autobiographical work on Jesus' life. It's actually going to be through the Spirit entering in to cause this writing, right? Because if you think about words, right? Even words themselves, if I say the word honeybee, you don't just think of a honeybee. You don't just think of the letters honeybee. You think of the form of beeness itself, right? So not to get too into the theological topic here, but when we say the word God, when we talk about God, we don't just mean, this theoretical idea. We mean God himself. God himself. So, in the same way, right? We're amping up this level to the next level. When we talk about the word, when we talk about the scriptures, we're not just talking about the idea of scriptures themselves. We are talking about God entering into us to remind us, to fill us, to tell us what the scriptures actually mean, to enter beyond just the physical actions of the church and Jesus and all the prophets and Israel. God encounters us in the midst of these stories. It goes beyond word. It's not just down to our might to remember God. It's not down to our intellect to know God, or else only the smartest in the church, right, would be gifted with the fullness of knowledge. No, all of us are, by being filled with the Holy Spirit. So it always comes back to word and spirit. On the one hand, we have the word, right, that Jesus is reason. In the first book of John, or in John chapter 1, rather, he tells us that Jesus is the Word incarnate, come down to us. Now, this idea of word is actually a Greek word called logos, right? And the logos came down to us. Now, John is purposefully drawing on the philosophical idea that the logos, right, is this word that encapsulates all of philosophy. So that Jesus isn't just the Spirit, he is also reason itself. It is truth. He is truth itself. So it's not just spirit, right? It's not this unmoored spirituality rooted in nothingness. It is rooted in reason itself, but it's not just pure reason. The reason is rooted in the word as well. So that God's being is actually, as the philosophers said, reason, but it's also more than just what the philosophers said. God is so much and so far beyond just a reason or a philosophy or a philosophical idea. So this is the question that we have, right? How do we ascend to God? Because for many philosophers, the idea was ascending up to God through reason. This is a common philosophical idea. And so God, as the meaning of the universe and truth, we have to use our reason to work our way up to God, because if we reason well enough to the truth, we can understand who God is in himself. But God's being is not understood as ascending, but as this descending to us, to enter into us, to become less. I went to Moody Bible Institute, which is a well-known Christian Bible institution, and I knew a lot of people there who got more reason, more thoughts about God, more studies about God, but ended up further away from the truth, further away from God. So we have to stop fooling ourselves that more Bible study will get us closer to God. Because if that's the truth, your God is a philosophy. Your God is theology, not God himself. We have to be careful not to reduce God down to our studies. And I worry that that's happened to a lot of us. Because if God is just an idea and not spirit, then God's being is just how much we study, how much we know. It doesn't have anything to do with people, doesn't have anything to do with love, doesn't have anything to do with all these things that God is in God's truest nature. Don't let your God become a philosophy. Don't let your God be reduced to just word. Don't let your God just become the Bible. So many people just worship the scripture and the Bible and don't actually ever meet God in God's truest being. And so we become these malformed Christians, not even really Christians at all, because we're so trying to just ascend to God, like the philosophers. We forget that God is more than that. God is more than that. So we've established this far that God is the nature of existence itself, right? That God is being itself. And to understand God is to make sense of our lives, right? To make sense of the whole of the universe. And this is what philosophy and theology are chasing after, right? How to understand the true nature of God. And we approach God through, right? We approach God through the person of Jesus Christ. But Jesus is known through this descending, right? Through lowering himself. And we are supposed to emulate that. And being like God in God's fullness is not to become all powerful, not to smite other people with our knowledge. It's actually to become lower. To become lower, which is why Jesus preached so much on being last. Because that's who God seeks to be. So we're supposed to be, as Romans 8:29 says, conformed to the image of his Son. I want you to ask some hard questions today. And it's fine if you just shut down this video. Maybe if you've made it this far, congratulations. It's easy to just shut down right now. But I want you to take a moment to ask yourself, what did you want to be when you grew up? What do you want to be right now? If you could just let your imagination go wild in the full honesty, and if I'm being honest, right? If I'm letting my just selfish desires run wild, who I want to be is a great philosopher, this amazing teacher, right? This powerful person who has money enough to spend on whatever I like. That's really what I want. But that being is so far less than what I could truly be in Jesus' image. So with that reflection, who should I truly be? Who do you truly want to be? What are you supposed to truly be in the image of Jesus? What does that practically mean for you? And what's stopping you from getting there?